Good evening and welcome to Dessert and Dish. Dessert and Dish is our weekly interview feature inviting real people to dish on the real challenges and blessings of living faithful lives. Dessert and Dish features a weekly dessert, hopefully something local or maybe homemade, because I think a lot of us have the experience that dessert helps to make conversations even better, good conversations even better, and we all need a little reminder of the sweetness of the kingdom of God already at work in our midst. Tonight, Scott is my co-host, and we are dishing with Matt Gillard, who is relatively new on our pastoral staff at St. George's, although it feels like we've known Matt forever. And all of you are going to have a chance to get to know Matt even better tonight. So welcome, Matt, and thanks for co-hosting with me, Scott. We're going to introduce Matt in a little bit more detail, but we always like to introduce dessert first. And that's why I have Cecilia and Gordon here with me tonight, because each of us had to just figure out our own desserts in our own homes with stay-at-home orders and that kind of thing. It wasn't the time to be going around doing dessert drop-offs as much as we would like to. So we each have a dessert to introduce. I'm going to introduce mine first. You can tell that the kids are really enjoying it because they can't stop eating it. What dessert did we make here at our house?
We made Dolce de Leche squares.
So maybe you can hold that up a little closer. It's really goopy. Here it is in the pan. Looks a little bit more professional in the pan. Anyway, they're called Dolce de Leche squares, but actually it's kind of a recipe that was originally supposed to have Dolce de Leche in it, and we've swapped it out for a homemade caramel sauce in the middle. So that's why it looks so goopy. There's no Dolce de Leche, but there is a lot of really good goopiness in these squares. So I was going to make oatmeal cookies tonight, and the kids campaigned for these squares, and Gordon's already finished his. So there we go. That's our dessert here. Thanks, guys.
Welcome.
Yeah, you can take the pan downstairs. All right, what have you got for dessert, Matt?
Well, normally I would like to have done cinnamon buns, but because when I make them, there's normally a large batch of them and I can't hand them out to people, they would have spoiled. So tonight I just have a butter tart from Giant Tiger. So not exactly local and not exactly homemade, but these I can keep in my freezer so that the food does not go to waste right now.
I mean, butter tarts, that's something I can always get behind. So, and honestly, when you do want to make a batch of cinnamon buns and it is okay to be out dropping them off, sign me. I'll trade you some Dolce de Leche squares for some cinnamon buns.
That sounds like a fair trade.
Okay. And Scott, why don't you tell us about what you're eating and drinking over at your place?
So also kind of in the same vein as Matt, in that it's not homemade but store acquired. Some fudge from Clifton Hill, from the Fudge Factory, and so it's still in the package. Wanted it to be fresh, but sort of a hazelnuts and caramel mix, I believe. So, and then in an effort to do something a little bit more local, I am a bit of a fan of coffee, and so local roaster and cafe, 416 Coffee Co. Their storefront is in Port Dalhousie, and their roastery is on Wright Street, for those that know St. Catharines. And fantastic family-owned business, really wonderful people and really good coffee. So the espresso that I made up, or I used the coffee in an espresso machine. I made up their Bolivia Teo Ponte this evening. So thank you to Chris and Carmen and the whole 416 Coffee Co crew. And thanks to the Fudge Factory on Clifton Hill.
Nice. Those are some really great local shout outs. So thank you for that. Awesome. All right. Well, now that we're all set with our sweets and Scott with his coffee, let's get into our dish and meet Matt. So lots of you at St. George's have been getting to know Matt since the fall, but we know that there's always a wide variety of people who tune in for our various YouTube offerings. So not everybody will have the same knowledge of Matt that everybody else does. Matt is our Lay Pastoral Associate. He is full-time at St. George's since January. He leads Bible and book studies. He was leading our confirmation classes. He helps with pastoral care. He preaches on the preaching roster on a fairly regular basis. A regular leader in our Sunday and Wednesday services. He is a huge asset in our STEP Resource Center, working with young people in our community, particularly those who find themselves in need of a helping hand. He coordinates the tablet ministry, which helps people connect with our services if they're not online. What am I missing, Matt? You've got quite a resume going on here.
I don't know if you are missing anything at the moment. At least I've sort of forgotten other stuff as well. So I've just had such a wonderful experience, and those things keep me pretty happy and busy, and I'm happy that they seem to be of service to others.
Yeah, I said right at the beginning that it feels like you've been here for a long time, and I mean that in like the best way. It just feels like you kind of stepped right in and got right involved, and you've just become such a great asset to and part of our team. It's been wonderful.
Well, there's just such a wonderful team spirit here. So thank you for helping me to integrate so well.
Nice.
So for those who are just getting to know Matt, and maybe those who know him a little bit but don't know, Matt, can you give us a bit of a bird's eye view on where you come from? Because like me, you're not originally from the area, or like
Me
Martha,
neither.
like all of us.
Yeah. We're all imports.
That's true. We are all imports to St. Catharines. So can you give people an idea of where you come from and where you've been?
Okay. So I was born and raised in London, Ontario. And my mother was a high school music teacher, and my father is an Anglican priest, although he got out of full-time parish ministry when I was very young, and was sort of a stay-at-home father. And born and raised in London, spent summers on my mother's family farm south of London. What else? I went to school in New Brunswick for visual arts for my undergraduate degree, and then moved back to London to do my master's degree in divinity. And then towards the end of that, decided to become a postulant with the Diocese of Niagara. And it's been quite a wonderful adventure all the way along.
Nice. That kind of walks us through the different places along your route, and we're glad that you're now settled into St. Catharines. You moved here because there wasn't enough to do around Christmas time, so you moved like what, 5 days before Christmas or something wild like that?
3, I think. December 21st. So
Oh my
Christmas
gosh.
Eve. Yeah.
But
It was,
you're settling in though.
yeah, got most of my stuff set up here. Haven't been too many changes since I've moved in as far as apartment and living conditions go. Yeah, very happy to be here.
Nice. Well, I want to just pick up on you mentioning that your undergrad is in visual arts. I think it's really interesting that all three of us do have degrees in the arts. So Scott and I both have a degree in music, and now you're with us and you have a degree in visual arts. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself as an artist and, you know, what media you particularly work in or how that interest developed in your life?
I guess medium-wise, I studied printmaking and sculpture in my undergrad, but right now I like to do mostly just drawing and sketching in my sketchbook, and sometimes I paint. And I also really like sewing and doing sewing projects. I guess I kind of picked up drawing from a very early age. I just always liked doing drawings of things I saw in movies, whether it was like ships or landscapes or maps were always fun to draw. And then I started drawing like costumes and props from movies and just as, outfits that I wanted to try making my own at some point. And then, yeah, I guess, sorry, I think one of the other questions you wanted to ask was how it might have informed faith, or?
Yeah, that was my next question. So
Sorry,
that's,
I wasn't
no,
sure if you had already asked that or not.
that's okay. I mean, that's a really important question. I think it's really interesting, like I said, that the three of us all have a background in the arts. And so I'd like to know from you how art informs your spirituality, how that's connected to your relationship with God. And I'd be interested to hear from both of you why you think there might be such a natural relationship between those who are in the arts and those who serve in parish ministry. But let's start with you and your spirituality, Matt, how art connects you to God.
Well, it kind of started in art history. There was just so much of a rich tradition of Christian art. And what I kind of quickly found was I was often one of the few students in my class who had any sort of church background or vocabulary around some of the stories that were being depicted in the art. And I mean, most of my classmates were seeing some pretty negative stuff about the church in the media. And I think you've talked about what it's like to have classmates see different images of the church than what we're experiencing. And when I got to my undergrad, conversations just kept happening about themes around the church and theology and how they integrated into art. And I just kept wanting to bring some of that stuff back into the conversation. And I was seeing connections with what some of my classmates were doing in different strains of theology. And I thought, okay, the conversation here is what was important. And I wanted to have more of those conversations with people. Mm-hmm. And I also was starting to feel like I just didn't have enough of the answers to address what some of my classmates were asking me. So I wanted to do more study on it and get more training on it. There was also something of a nurturing aspect to it where sometimes I could feel that they were uncomfortable with some of the stuff and just wanted to let some of them know that that was okay or whatever. So,
yeah. So I find that interesting. And certainly I experienced the same thing in terms of mostly focusing on music history in my undergrad. And there are, just a huge, like intricately connected relationship between studying music and studying the church and studying religion. So I'm hearing you kind of name this like almost pastoral response or like apologetic response, like as in kind of being able to lay out the reason for faith in the face of your classmates' questions, and then that spurring you on to want to learn more and study more. And I think that's really cool. I guess I'm curious, in the midst of all of that, whether there's a, a, a personal prayer element at all for you in terms of the actual act of creating art. I mean, you talked about loving to sew and loving to draw. I mean, do you experience that as that creative impulse as also a spiritual impulse? Like, not to put words in your mouth, but
Sometimes, I mean, sometimes when I'm working on different art projects, sometimes if they're dealing with biblical or theological themes, that's an opportunity to wrestle with those things in prayer, which is, I guess, different than prayers of supplication or prayers of asking for things. It was more of a time to wrestle with different ideas. And I don't know if I ever saw that. I guess I tended to see that more as service to myself and more of something for myself, whereas some of the ministry stuff that I've been doing or some of those conversations I was having, those felt more like ministry to others. So I don't know. I guess one of the distinctions I started to feel about art was that it was more about myself, whereas ministry was more about others. But that also kind of changed because when I sort of retreated with my art to things that I was just interested in, it kept bringing things and influences from either my theological studies or concerns in the wider community. And so filters of doing ministry to others kept coming back into it as I continued to try to do some things on my own while going through seminary. Does that make any sense? Or
yeah, I mean, it's I think it's really interesting. It's, to be honest, it's kind of not the answer I was expecting, just because like I in music and in writing, which are kind of the two arts that I pursue the most, to me those are kind of my most visceral experience of prayer, because they're an experience of how I get to connect into the creative power of God, right? So I wondered if you had a similar experience when you're drawing, when you're sewing, when you're participating in the arts, whether that draws you closer to God. I'm hearing different aspects of how that connects you to ministry, and I appreciate that it's not the answer I thought you were going to give. So
yeah, sorry about that.
no, gosh, I mean, this is a conversation. Like, this is the great thing about it, right? Is like we don't experience things in the same way. So I think that's really, really interesting. Yeah. And I think that interplay that you kind of named between the person, you at the heart of the ministry that you're doing, and the concerns of the world, and the relationship between those pieces and God, and the way that art facilitates that is really interesting as well. And maybe that does get at something of why artists can make good priests. Scott, do you have any thoughts about why we keep we have such a high percentage of our pastoral staff with degrees in the arts?
I mean, in some ways, I think we're just lucky because
I love that.
well, so some of the other ministry situations that I've had the opportunity to serve in have been a little more varied than people just with degrees in the arts. When I served at the cathedral in Victoria, the dean, had an engineering background, and the other associate. I mean, besides having been a career cleric, if you will, she didn't have work before having been ordained. I actually can't remember what her undergrad was in. It was long enough ago, but it wasn't. Maybe more general arts, English or literature or something. But I think we are pretty lucky for two of us to have music degrees and Matt to have a fine arts degree, and for all that brings. I mean, we are lucky enough to serve in a tradition where all you have to do is look around the building to see the evidence of all of that, and more, right? I mean, there's so much art in the stained glass and the carving, the wood carvings around the church, and then the music, which all play key roles in our liturgical life, but then also in the expression of the community life as well. St. George's is pretty blessed with the opportunities that we have to share that art with a wider community, not just the parish community. So
Yeah, that's really, really well said, for sure.
So maybe taking a bit of a different tack, but Martha and I, although we've been steadfastly Anglican for a really long time, we aren't what you would call cradle Anglicans, in that like we weren't born directly into the church. And so your experience though, Matt, especially with your dad having been a priest, I mean, you are a cradle Anglican, and so do you have any sense or insight as to how that has shaped you and your experience, how that has informed or helped shape your faith?
Faith and experience of the church. I guess church was always that community that I could never stay away from. And I guess my family eventually settled into a church called Bishop Cronin Memorial Anglican. And when I was 7, we, I think, arrived there. And within a few months, I was serving at the altar. And that just never stopped. And there was kind of always a very welcoming invitation to continue participating in the life of the church. I mean, both parents sort of always emphasize that, yes, your people are welcoming you to do this, but don't ever treat it like you're entitled to do it. It's always very much a privilege. And there are responsibilities that come with participating in the life of the church. So there were elements like that involved. And there was also just a lot of fun and positive relationships just being built up through a long life in the church, and that we talked about theology, church politics, and liturgy and church history. These were actually parts of our dinner table conversations and conversations in the car, on road trips. So it was very much part of life lived outside of the church. And I mean, when we had friends from the church, we would talk to them about this stuff. And sometimes when we had friends from school come over, if they were comfortable, we would talk to them about some of this stuff, or answer questions or hear their opinions. It was just, I don't know, the conversation of church has always been present for as long as I can remember.
I really love that, those images of like road trips and the supper table and guests over, and just like kind of the natural intertwining of church life and the community of faith life with kind of all aspects of of everything else. Like, how cool is that?
In hindsight, it was very cool. I mean, there are other things we did as a family, like we did, gardening, or we watched movies, or we went camping. And sometimes we would talk about the church while we were doing that. Sometimes it was just, we're watching a movie. That's what we're doing. We're watching The Lion King right now. And how it might connect with the Bible, that might be a conversation that happened, but no, sometimes you're just watching the movie.
Right.
So yeah.
It wasn't it wasn't kind of an imprisoning force. It was just kind of a natural piece that ebbed and flowed throughout your life, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was as Scott said, I grew up in the church, and my family started going to the Anglican church when I was I think about 7. But like church was just something that I did because it made my mom happy for many years. It wasn't, and I mean, relationship with God is kind of another part to tease out of that, because that felt very separate for me from church. But I had this real experience around the age of 15. I describe it as like falling in love with Jesus, um, where, you know, like it went from being something that I had inherited to something that I was claiming for myself. So I guess I'm like interested as to whether you can pinpoint any of those transitions or any of those spiritual experiences that kind of moved you from it being something that this is what my family does to like this is something that I think ideally we would love for that moment for kids to take place at their confirmation. I can tell you absolutely and fully that's not when it happened for me. I did my confirmation, when I was supposed to do it, and it was a few years beyond that when it really became something that I was laying claim to. So, did you have those experiences or transitions at all?
Um, there was no sort of one moment where it was a faith that I claimed for myself. It was kind of a constant case of there's this faith that has been inherited and it's always being challenged,
Mm,
and not just by the wider world, but those who I'm inheriting it from are also challenging it and asking questions from it. So it never was something that was just given, here's what we do, you're going to do this. It was, here's what we do, what do you think about this? So in just having to answer all those questions and those challenges, I guess there was kind of a constant claiming it at different times.
I like that. That's a really organic sort of answer like that. And it wasn't one moment for me either, but yeah, I like that, it was just this constant work in progress for you and sort of a constant having to articulate why you continue to say yes, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd also say that it was something that developed. It was something that, although it might have been initially inherited, it matured and it developed. And I mean, I don't know if it ever changed into something different than from what I inherited, because when I look back, there are a lot of core values that are still the same. And I mean, things like Sunday worship might be the most visible part of the faith, but it does not happen in isolation. There's a lot of work and preparation that goes into it. And the faith gives lived out in all of life. So the ethics and values that we hear about on Sundays get participated in life. And the faith is an ongoing conversation, not only in the family, but in the wider community. God, Jesus, and the Bible and theology are not only subjects for the Sunday sermon, they're subjects for the dinner conversation, the car rides. We don't just talk about these things with our parents, but with those who are visiting us and those who we encounter out in the community. So those, I guess, were things that were inherited, but they're just they're still there, but they kind of, the knowledge around a lot of that stuff and the way I feel the connection with God and the church has matured and changed sort of through all those challenges.
Well, and it really sounds to me like you were given the gift that, I would say I was given too, and I imagine Scott would say this as well. The gift of being invited into a living faith rather than kind of being given the rule book or like, here are the things that you are to believe. I never experienced the Christian faith as an oppressive force in my life at all. It was always that invitational, conversational, kind of experience. And I think it's a remarkable privilege to have grown up with that kind of freedom, that the freedom that I think is meant to be in our faith, right? Like, I think we are to be free to love God, not forced to love God, not threatened into loving God, right? Like, I don't think any of us grew up threatened into loving God.
No, and that was something that my father was also very intentional about. Because he said that he had seen a number of cases where families had forced their kids into the faith. And he had seen that just cause so much damage, and the kids don't come back to the church. And so he emphasized from a very early age with both my brother and I that our participation in church was our choice. If we wanted to do it, our parents would give us rides there. We could come with them to church. But if we wanted to stay home, once we came of a certain age, I think it was maybe 12 or 13, we could do that if we wanted. And both of us kept going to church.
Well, that was kind of my other part of the question is, lots of people your age either didn't grow up in the church or drifted away from the church. And it sounds like that freedom was a big reason why you stayed. Are there any other reasons that kind of kept you connected? Any like takeaways in terms of how we reach out to younger generations from here?
It was both the freedom of choice to be there, but it was also the invitation to be part of the conversation. There were people of so many different age ranges and different backgrounds in my church who I could have conversations with, and they thought it was cool to be chatting with a young person about their faith. And the clergy in particular, who I knew growing up, also kept the conversation going and invited myself and other young people to the conversation. And so you'll hear me use that word conversation a lot, because that was a pretty formative element and dynamic of being part of the church.
Yeah, I have noticed you using that word a lot. And, I think it was pretty key actually in Jesus' ministry too, like that there was a real back and forth and mutuality in the ministry that Jesus engaged. So I think conversation is a very holy word.
Mm-hmm.
And pardon me, thinking, I mean, not to overuse the road trip analogy, but I mean, everything that you've described is very much, growing into, a faith that is your own and continues to grow. So I mean that, that conversation is part of that. But I mean, to use the road trip image, you grew up going on road trips, learning how it happens, and and you learn how to run the road trip and drive the car, and now you're driving the car on the road trip, right? So maybe it's not a family road trip yet, but
Scott, you're scaring me a little bit as a mother of kids who are getting like way too close to learning how to drive. But anyway, I digress.
it's a necessary part, right? So here you are on your road trip, Matt, and you're journeying down the the road of postulancy. You're a postulant with the diocese, as you had said. So you are looking at ordained ministry and going through all the necessary processes there. So yeah, I mean, what excites you about this part of the journey? What excites you about the work that lies ahead, and the sense of calling?
I guess some of those inherited parts that we've already talked about, particularly keeping the church about a dialogue with people. I love the mixture of theological diversity combined with some very old traditions and symbols that exist within the Anglican Church, and the life and ministry that of Jesus have also created and continue to sort of nurture a great sense of service to others that I see alive in so many parts of the church, and I find very fulfilling. And then there's kind of just a very simple feeling that this is sort of what I'm supposed to be doing, and it feels fulfilling as it is. And I mean, doesn't have to stay exactly as it is. There's going to be more changes and challenges, as well as more joys, that both challenges and joys that I cannot yet imagine. But it feels like the right thing to be doing.
I think that's a really cool way of putting it because, I think back to like when I was starting out in ministry, and I mean, everything terrified me. Like everything was a new experience. I was always like on the steepest learning curve ever for every single, like, whether it was leading a study or visiting a hospital room or praying with people or preaching or whatever. Like it was all way out of my comfort zone. And at the same time, like I felt like myself, like that's kind of what I'm hearing you say too, is like, this feels like you, like this feels like what you're being called to do.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't think you're on as steep a learning curve as I was when I was starting out, but so again, I'm not like trying to read my experience onto yours, but yeah, I think that sense of, sure, you're going to be trying new things and you're going to be out of your element, hopefully, like I think if you're not out of your element a bit, then you're missing something, right? But also that there's this sense of self that's emerging and being grounded in that. I think that's really awesome. And Scott, does that kind of resonate with your experience too of ministry?
Yeah, I mean the to push the road trip analogy way too far. I mean, it continues to be that process of discernment, right? So that edge of never necessarily feeling 100% comfortable with what's going on, or what I find myself doing, and yet at the same time having those experiences that confirm and support that there is a large part of my identity that is confirmed by the work in the church, that to use that language, it does feel like me. It does feel like a calling, and I'm very wary of using that, just because in some ways, because I think that we all possess the capability of doing so many different things, and that part of that discernment is figuring out what we, not just what we're supposed to be doing, but what we can do and what we can do well, and to think of the myriad of gifts. I mean, Matt with your fine arts degree and Martha and I with our music degrees. There are lots of things that we can do well, but there is something about being able to bring all of that together, and to have it come together in ministry in the church, and to have that confirmed that, yes, this is the place for you, or a good place for you, a good fit. So and as I said, always that sort of edge of like, well, maybe I'm supposed to be doing something else. I don't know. But yeah, and I think that's just a part of um, a piece of holding yourself accountable, holding um, uh, trying to maintain, responsibility about being on top of that discernment and not losing that edge, because it keeps us open to what lies ahead. Same as not falling asleep at the wheel on a road trip. So
Yeah, I think it also, like, I really, really like that, Scott. And I think the other piece for me is that, like, I assume God isn't done with me yet, right? Like, I assume I'm still a work in progress. And so I think making sure that discernment is always part of your life is really important, as long as you assume that, like, you're not a finished product. None of us really gets to be a finished product. Thank
Yeah.
goodness. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, that that statement of it just being a simple feeling of that I'm doing what I'm supposed to, that actually kind of took a while to acknowledge, because like you talk about there being all these things that you can do well, and ministry always being about discernment. And for me, particularly when I was looking at going to theology school, so towards the end of my BFA, I was seeing just kind of a number of different elements that attracted me to the church and to work in the church. And I'm like, well, which one of these is it that distinguishes a call, or what combination of it is it? And at some point it said, well, some of these are going to be useful at some point, and other times you're going to have to put them aside. And kind of the one, or that sense of a call, or that you're doing what you're supposed to, might just sort of be that one thing that is either consistent, or maybe not consistent, but it's one of the things that unifies all the different things that are always sort of changing and shifting in ministry.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. So with the sense of call, and this sense of the road trip and the journey, and all that lies ahead, Matt, what's your dream for a faithful and fruitful church? What do you most want to share with others about your faith going forward? What do you most want the church to share with others?
I got a couple of things here, and I really like this question, because when I thought about this question, I realized that the church is not just my dream, it's a dream that we all share. And I guess sometimes when I'm sharing it with others, I forget my own hopes, but because I like listening to the hopes that other people have for the church. But I guess if I were to name some of my own hopes, I'm hoping that the church continues to, where's my writing? I'm hoping that the church continues to be a conversation between believers. And I feel hope for the church when I hear other people talk about their faith. And I'm sort of also hoping for a church that finds that missional balance between ministering to both their own congregations, but to the wider community. And that's one of the things I really love about St. George's is, I mean, we have some really strong exterior ministry programs like the Step Center and the Breakfast Program that minister to the specific surrounding community. But there's also a lot of community building and nurturing done to the congregation itself. So there's that. I'm also hoping that the church is able to find that balance between drawing on some of its wealth of traditions, some of the very old knowledge and stories and symbolism that it has, but that it's also able to help people are relating to God. I think there's sort of a wealth of symbols and stories and rituals that we have in our church. But I'm also using the word symbols here, in that signs are something that I guess have sort of a specific meaning to attached to them, but symbols are more of a dialogue where the viewer brings some of their own meaning and interpretation. So I'm hoping that the church is just always helping to keep this dialogue going with people.
I think that's the answer, and it sounds like it's so connected to your own spirituality and your own, the ways that you have connected most deeply with God, which just sounds like it's absolutely grounded in that dialogue and conversation, and the voices of the church speaking up and helping one another to draw closer in their knowledge and love of God. So it's a wonderful vision for the future. It's a wonderful vision for the now.
We've got a wonderful dream that we're all sharing, and just hoping it stays alive and in the best of ways.
Well, I'm pretty convinced it's God's dream too. So that means that, it'll stay alive. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Matt. I know that, we've really only just touched on getting to know you, but our congregation has lots of other ways of hearing from you and being part of your unfolding story, your road trip, as it were. So the conversation continues, the journey continues. Thank you, Matt, for being our guest tonight. Thank you, Scott, for co-hosting with me tonight. Thanks, everybody, for figuring out some dessert. Please join us next week. Next week, I'm going to be chatting with two of my fellow female priests, Sheila Van Zandwick and Kathy Morgan. And so we're looking forward to Clergy Gal Pals conversation next week. So thank you to our entire congregation, viewers, participants. Thank you for being part of how together we get to eat and talk and participate in the sweetness of life.